Little girl touches millionaire's arm during his wife's funeral and says 3 words. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The cold wind swept through Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, rustling the golden-brown leaves that had begun to gather around the freshly dug grave. The sky was a dull gray, a fitting backdrop to the grief weighing down on the mourners. Among them stood David Reynolds, a man known for his immense wealth, business empire, and the power that came with it. Yet today, none of that mattered. Today he was just a man who had lost his wife. Evelyn had been his anchor. She was the only one who had ever seen the man behind the millions, behind the ruthless decisions, behind the suit and tie. They had built a life together, one filled with love, laughter, and regret. The regret of never having children had always haunted them, but they had learned to live with it. And now, as he stood by her grave watching the coffin being lowered into the earth, a hollowness filled his chest. It was as if part of him had been buried along with her. The funeral was grand, as expected. The city's elite had gathered, some out of genuine sorrow, others simply because it was the social event of the season. Colleagues, business partners, and friends came forward to offer their condolences, each handshake and hug feeling mechanical. David barely registered any of it. His world had become silent, drowned by the echoes of Evelyn's laughter, the warmth of her voice that would never reach his ears again. He wanted the crowd to disappear, to leave him alone with his grief, but he knew that was impossible. A man like him was never truly alone, except in the ways that mattered. As the service ended and people started to drift away, David remained still, staring at the polished wood of the coffin, now covered in dirt. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled his coat tighter around himself, the cold biting through the fabric. His driver, an old man named Joe, waited patiently at a distance, knowing his employer needed this moment. David took a deep breath and turned to leave when his eyes caught something unusual. A young woman stood near the edge of the cemetery, half hidden behind a tall oak tree. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. She wasn't dressed like the others. While the attendees wore expensive black coats and designer scarves, she wore a simple jacket, slightly worn out, and jeans that had seen better days. Her long, brown hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and there was something familiar about the way she stood, her hands clenched into fists as if battling an inner turmoil. David frowned, trying to place her. He didn't recognize her from any business circles, nor did she look like someone who belonged in his world. Yet there was something about her, something that made his heart beat just a little faster, though he couldn't understand why. She took a hesitant step forward, then stopped as if reconsidering her decision. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, and David felt a strange pull toward her. But before he could say anything, she turned on her heel and walked away. "Sir?" Joe's voice broke through his thoughts. "Car is ready." David glanced at the retreating figure of the young woman, then shook his head. It was probably nothing. Maybe she was a distant relative of Evelyn, someone who had come to pay respects but didn't feel comfortable approaching. He dismissed the strange encounter and walked toward the car, his mind already sinking back into the abyss of loss. That night, as David sat in his penthouse overlooking the New York skyline, the image of the girl haunted him. He had never been one to dwell on strangers, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something significant about her presence at the cemetery. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling under the dim light of his study. His eyes flickered toward a framed photograph of Evelyn on his desk. "I miss you," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. Evelyn had always been the one to see meaning in things, to believe that everything happened for a reason. If she were here, she would have told him not to ignore his gut feeling about the girl. He sighed and took a sip of his drink, telling himself it was just grief playing tricks on his mind. But deep down, he knew this was not the last time he would see her. David Reynolds had never been a man to dwell on the past or obsess over insignificant moments, but for some reason, he couldn't get the image of the young woman out of his mind. That night, sleep refused to come. He lay awake in his Manhattan penthouse staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the city. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her again, standing by the oak tree, her face pale, her hands clenched, her expression torn between fear and desperation. Something about her unsettled him, though he couldn't explain why. By morning, he convinced himself that he was overthinking. It was grief playing tricks on his mind. The funeral had been emotionally exhausting, and maybe he had simply imagined the intensity of the moment. He told himself to forget about it, but forgetting wasn't easy. The next afternoon, David found himself sitting in his office on the 54th floor of the Reynolds Corporation building, staring blankly at a stack of reports. His assistant, Mark, had scheduled back-to-back meetings, but he had barely paid attention to any of them. His mind was elsewhere, fixated on the mystery girl. He had spent his entire life making calculated decisions, solving problems, and predicting market trends with precision. Yet he couldn't shake off the feeling that this was something important. Frustrated with himself, he picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. "Joe, I need you to do something for me," David said as soon as his driver answered. "Do you remember that young woman at the cemetery yesterday? The one who stood by the oak tree?" There was a brief pause on the other end before Joe responded. "Yeah, saw her. Looked like she wanted to say something, but changed her mind." "Exactly," David muttered. "I need to find out who she is." "You think she knew Mrs. Reynolds?" Joe asked. "I don't know," David admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But I have a feeling she wasn't just some stranger. Check with the cemetery staff, maybe they saw something. Find out whatever you can." Joe agreed, and David ended the call, feeling a mix of anticipation and unease. He had no idea why he was so determined to find this girl. Maybe it was because Evelyn had always been the one to believe in fate, and a part of him wondered if this was some kind of sign. Later that evening, David was sitting in his penthouse with a drink in his hand when Joe called back. "Sir, I found her," Joe said without preamble. David sat up straight. "Who is she?" "Her name is Lena Brooks. She's 24 years old, lives in Queens. And this is where it gets interesting. Her mother was a woman named Sarah Brooks." David's grip on the glass tightened at the mention of that name. Sarah Brooks. A name he hadn't heard in over 2 decades, but one he had never forgotten. His heart pounded against his ribs as memories he had buried long ago resurfaced. Sarah had been his first love back when he was just a young man struggling to make a name for himself. They had met in Chicago, where he had been working as an ambitious investment analyst trying to climb the corporate ladder. Sarah had been different from anyone he had ever known. Wild, free-spirited, with a laugh that could light up a room. They had fallen in love fast and hard, but it hadn't lasted. When David had been offered a life-changing opportunity in New York, he had chosen his career over love. Sarah had begged him to stay, told him that they could build a life together anywhere, but he had been too consumed by his ambitions. The last time he had seen her, she had been crying, telling him that he would regret leaving her. He had ignored her. Now, over 25 years later, her name was suddenly back in his life. And so was her daughter. David swallowed hard. "Did you find out anything else?" Joe hesitated. "Yes, sir. Sarah passed away last year, cancer." A strange tightness formed in David's chest. Sarah was gone, just like Evelyn, and now her daughter. His daughter? No, that wasn't possible. If Lena was 24, that meant Sarah had been pregnant when he left. And she never told him. The weight of the realization nearly knocked the breath out of him. Had he unknowingly abandoned his own child? Joe's voice broke through his thoughts. "What do you want to do, sir?" David didn't answer right away. His mind was racing, trying to piece everything together. If Lena was really his daughter, that meant she had grown up without him. Had she suffered? Had Sarah struggled to raise her alone? Guilt clawed at his stomach at the thought of Sarah fighting cancer without anyone to help her. He had lived his life in luxury while his own child, if she really was his, might have struggled. "I need to talk to her," David finally said, his voice firm. "Find out where she works, what she does. I need to see her." Joe agreed and hung up, leaving David alone with his thoughts. He stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the city he had built his empire in. For the first time in years, the success and wealth felt meaningless. He had spent his entire life chasing something, only to realize he had left behind something far more important. But the question remained, did Lena know? Had Sarah told her about him? Or had she grown up believing she had no father at all? Hours later, when the city had gone quiet and the only sound in the penthouse was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, David pulled out an old box from the back of his closet. Inside were letters, photographs, memories he had locked away. He found a picture of himself and Sarah from all those years ago, her smile bright, his arms wrapped around her. His throat tightened as he realized how much time had passed. He didn't know what Lena wanted from him, or if she even wanted anything at all, but one thing was certain. His life had just changed forever. David sat in his office the next morning, but for the first time in his life, business matters meant nothing to him. The reports on his desk, the emails piling up, the phone calls waiting to be returned. All of it felt distant, insignificant. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in the memories of a past he had long buried. Sarah Brooks. Her name echoed in his head like a song he had once loved but forgotten. And now Lena Brooks, a name he had never known but suddenly couldn't stop thinking about. The weight of realization sat heavy on his chest. If she really was his daughter, that meant he had missed her entire life. 24 years of birthdays, first steps, school plays, hardships, everything, and all because Sarah had never told him. Or had she? Had she tried to reach him, and he had been too blinded by ambition to notice? The thought sent a sharp pang of guilt through him. Joe had been efficient as always. By noon, David had a full report in front of him. Where Lena lived, where she worked, and a few details about her life. She was a waitress at a small diner in Queens, barely making ends meet. She lived in a modest apartment, nothing like the penthouses and mansions David had spent his life acquiring. She had no immediate family left, no siblings, no parents. Just her. The realization struck him harder than he expected. She had grown up without a father, and now she had lost her mother too. Had she stood by Sarah's grave the way he had stood by Evelyn's, feeling the same crushing loneliness? He had spent his entire life making ruthless decisions without second-guessing himself. But this was different. This was personal, and for once, he didn't know what the right move was. Did he walk into that diner and tell her the truth? Did she even want to know? The way she had looked at him at the funeral, it was as if she had been debating whether to approach him. Did she already suspect, or had she simply been there to pay respects to Evelyn? Too many questions, no answers. By late afternoon, David found himself in Queens, sitting in the back of his black town car watching from a distance as Lena worked inside the diner. He had told himself he wouldn't go in. He just wanted to see her. But now that he was here, he couldn't take his eyes off her. She was wiping down a table, her movements quick and practiced, a tired but polite smile on her face as she spoke to a customer. Her long brown hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, a few strands falling over her face. And then, for a brief moment, she laughed. It was barely audible from where he sat, but something about it sent a shiver down his spine. It was familiar, not in the way Evelyn's voice had been, but in another way, a deeper way. It was Sarah's laugh. His chest tightened. This wasn't just speculation anymore. He knew. He could feel it. Without thinking, he opened the car door and stepped out. Joe gave him a questioning look from the driver's seat, but David ignored him. He crossed the street, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. The bell above the diner's door jingled as he stepped inside. The smell of coffee and greasy food filled the air, mixing with the sound of conversation and the clatter of dishes. A few heads turned his way. He didn't exactly blend in. His expensive suit and polished shoes made him look like a man completely out of place in a modest diner like this. But he didn't care. His eyes were locked on Lena. She hadn't noticed him yet. She was pouring coffee for an elderly man at the counter, nodding along to whatever he was saying. David took a deep breath and walked toward her. And then, as if sensing something, she turned. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time stood still. Lena froze, the coffee pot in her hand trembling slightly. There was no mistaking the recognition in her eyes. She knew exactly who he was. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice steady but guarded. David's throat went dry. She knew his name. That meant she had looked him up. "I was hoping we could talk," he said, his voice lower than usual. She set the coffee pot down, wiping her hands on her apron. "About what?" He glanced around. The diner wasn't busy, but there were still enough people around to make this a less than ideal place for such a conversation. "Somewhere private." She studied him for a moment, then let out a breath. "I get off in an hour. If you're still here by then, we can talk." David nodded, then turned and walked toward an empty booth near the window. He could feel the eyes of the other customers on him, curious about the man in the expensive suit who had just walked in asking for their waitress. But none of it mattered. All that mattered was the fact that she hadn't refused. An hour felt like an eternity. He sat there pretending to read the menu, sipping on a cup of coffee he barely tasted. He watched as she moved through the diner, acting as if nothing was out of the ordinary, but he could tell she was unsettled. Finally, when her shift ended, she pulled off her apron and walked toward him, her expression unreadable. "There's a park a few blocks from here," she said. "We can walk and talk." David stood up and followed her out, his heart racing. The cool evening air wrapped around them as they walked in silence for a few minutes. Finally, she stopped near a bench and turned to face him. "I know who you are," she said, crossing her arms. "I've known for a while." David swallowed hard. "Did your mother ever tell you?" Lena shook her head. "Not directly, but I found out when she got sick. I started looking through old papers, medical records, and your name was on my birth certificate." His chest tightened. "She never told me." "I figured," she said bitterly. "Because you never came. You never looked for us. You just left." David felt like he had been punched in the gut. "If I had known." "But you didn't," she cut in. "And that's the point. My mom raised me alone. She worked 2 jobs just to make sure I had food on the table. And where were you? In your skyscraper, making your millions." The anger in her voice was justified, and David had no defense. He had no idea what to say to make this right. "I want to know you," he finally said. "If you'll let me." Lena stared at him for a long time before speaking. "I don't know if I want to know you." Then after a pause, she added, "But I'll think about it." It wasn't much, but it was something. David had spent his entire life closing deals, negotiating contracts, and making calculated decisions that ensured his success. But sitting in his penthouse that night, staring at the city lights of New York, he felt like a man who had lost control of everything. Lena's words kept echoing in his mind. "I don't know if I want to know you." She had every right to feel that way. He had been absent for her entire life, not because he had chosen to abandon her, but because he had never even known she existed. But did that change the reality of what she had gone through? She had grown up without a father, watching her mother struggle while he had lived in luxury, oblivious to the life he had left behind. No matter how much he tried to justify it to himself, the guilt was there, a weight pressing down on him. For the first time in decades, he found himself questioning the very foundation of his life. He had spent years chasing success, believing that wealth and power were the ultimate goals. And yet, standing at Sarah's grave, seeing Lena for the first time, he had realized how empty it all was. What did all his money mean if he had failed in the most important role of his life, being a father? He had spent years thinking that Evelyn was the only woman he had ever truly loved, but now memories of Sarah kept resurfacing. She had been different from anyone else he had ever met. She had been kind, intelligent, and fiercely independent. They had spent long nights talking about dreams, life, and the future, conversations he hadn't had with anyone since. And now she was gone, leaving behind a daughter who wanted nothing to do with him. The next morning, David made a decision. He wasn't going to force his way into Lena's life, but he wasn't going to disappear either. He wanted to help her even if she never accepted him as her father. He picked up the phone and called Joe. "I want you to set up a trust fund for Lena Brooks," he said. "She doesn't have to know it's from me, but I want her to have financial security." Joe hesitated on the other end. "Are you sure she won't find out?" David exhaled slowly. "Make it anonymous. Just make sure she's taken care of." A few days passed with no contact from Lena. David wanted to reach out, but he respected her space. Then one evening, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. His heart pounded as he answered. "Hello?" There was a pause, then a familiar voice. "It's Lena." David sat up straighter. "Lena, I'm glad you called." She let out a breath. "I've been thinking. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel about all of this, but I do have questions." David nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Ask me anything." She hesitated before speaking. "Did you love my mother?" The question caught him off guard. He had spent so long burying those emotions, but now, faced with Lena, he couldn't deny the truth. "Yes," he said finally. "I did." Lena was silent for a moment. "Then why weren't you there?" David ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't know, Lena. If I had—" He stopped, knowing that saying "I would have been there" wouldn't mean anything to her now. "I guess I just don't understand how my mom never told you," she said. "Neither do I," David admitted. "Maybe she thought I wouldn't care. Maybe she thought I was too caught up in my career, or maybe—" He hesitated. "Maybe she was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That I would take you away from her," David said softly. "She knew I had the resources, the connections. Maybe she was afraid that if I found out I'd try to fight for custody." Lena sighed. "Maybe." David decided to take a chance. "Would you like to meet? Talk in person?" There was a long pause, then finally she said, "Yeah, I think I would." They met at a quiet cafe in Brooklyn the next afternoon. When David arrived, Lena was already there, sitting by the window, stirring a cup of coffee. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. He sat down across from her, suddenly feeling more nervous than he had in any boardroom meeting. "You actually showed up," she said, raising an eyebrow. "I said I would," he replied. She studied him for a moment. "So, tell me about you. Not the billionaire you, but the real you." David wasn't sure if he even knew who that was anymore. "I grew up in Chicago," he began. "Middle-class family. My dad was a factory worker. My mom was a teacher. I worked my way through college, built my business from the ground up." He hesitated before adding, "I met your mother when I was in Seattle for a business trip. She was working at a bookstore. I walked in looking for a book and walked out completely captivated by her." A small smile tugged at the corner of Lena's lips. "That sounds like her." David nodded. She had this way of making everything feel like an adventure. "I think that's why I fell for her so quickly." Lena stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. "It's weird," she said, "hearing about my mom from someone who knew her in a completely different way than I did." David swallowed the lump in his throat. "I want to know about her life after me. What was she like as a mother?" Lena's eyes softened. "She was amazing, strong. She did everything for me. She worked 2 jobs, made sure I had everything I needed, even when it meant she had nothing for herself." David's guilt deepened. "She shouldn't have had to do it alone." "No, she shouldn't have," Lena said, her voice sharp. "But she did." David looked at her carefully. "What about you, Lena? What do you want in life?" She let out a small laugh. "That's a loaded question." She looked out the window. "I want to do something more than just waiting tables. I wanted to go to college, but that never worked out." David hesitated before speaking. "What if you still could?" She frowned. "What do you mean?" "What if money wasn't an issue?" Lena stiffened. "Are you trying to buy my forgiveness?" "No," David said firmly. "I just want to help. You don't have to accept anything from me, but if college is something you still want, I can make that happen." She looked at him for a long moment. I don't. No, you don't have to decide now, he said gently. Just think about it. She nodded slowly. I will. For the first time, David felt a flicker of hope. He had a long way to go to earn her trust, but at least now there was a chance. David had spent decades building his empire, mastering the art of negotiation, and ensuring that every risk he took in business led to profit. But sitting across from Lena in that quiet Brooklyn cafe, he realized this was a different kind of negotiation, one where numbers and strategies held no value. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about something far more fragile, rebuilding a connection with a daughter who had every reason to keep him at a distance. As the afternoon stretched on, their conversation grew heavier, dipping into the past, into regrets, and into the painful truths neither of them could ignore. Lena was careful with her words, guarded, as if she wasn't sure whether to let David in or keep the wall between them firmly intact. She sipped her coffee in slow, thoughtful gulps, her eyes searching his face for something. Perhaps sincerity, perhaps regret. And David, for the first time in years, found himself at a loss for words. I don't know what you expect from me, Lena finally said, setting her cup down. I don't even know what I expect from this. David leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. I don't expect anything. I just want to know you. She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. That's the thing, though. You don't know me. You never have. Her gaze flickered toward the window. And for 24 years, I didn't even know you existed. Her words hit like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just that he had missed out on raising her. It was that she had grown up believing she didn't have a father at all. There had been no bedtime stories, no birthdays spent together, no father-daughter traditions. Just silence. David exhaled, choosing his words carefully. I can't change the past, Lena. But I can be here now. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether or not she could trust him. And what does being here mean to you? Throwing money at me? Setting up some fancy trust fund to clear your conscience? He shook his head. That's not what this is about. He paused before adding, but if I can help you, I will. Lena sighed, rubbing her temples. I don't want your money, David. David felt a pang of frustration, not at her, but at the situation. He had spent his life fixing problems by writing checks, by making things happen, but this wasn't something that could be solved with a transaction. I understand, he said carefully. But what if it's not about the money? What if it's about giving you options? A future you actually want? She looked at him skeptically. And what if I don't even know what I want? Then we figure it out, he said simply. Lena exhaled sharply, tapping her fingers against the table. I'm not saying I'm ready to suddenly have this big father-daughter relationship with you. It's too soon for that. I understand, David said, trying to hide his disappointment. But she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Maybe we can take things slow, see where this goes. It wasn't a resounding yes. It wasn't the reunion some part of him had secretly hoped for. But it was something. A beginning. A week passed after their meeting, and David resisted the urge to bombard her with calls or messages. He wanted her to reach out on her own terms. And then, late one evening, his phone lit up with a message. Do you have time tomorrow? There's something I want to show you. David's fingers hovered over the keyboard before he responded. Of course. When and where? The next afternoon, David found himself in a neighborhood he had never been to before. Bushwick, Brooklyn. It was nothing like the glass towers and luxury condos he was used to. The streets were lined with old brick buildings, murals covering the walls, a blend of history and grit that told a story of its own. When he spotted Lena waiting outside a small storefront, he felt that familiar nervousness creep in again. You came, she said, tucking her hands into her coat pockets. Of course, he said. What is this place? She motioned toward the glass door. Come inside. David followed her in, and immediately he was met with the scent of fresh paint and something faintly metallic. The space was small but filled with energy. Canvases lined the walls, some still in progress, while others were already bursting with color and emotion. In the back, a few artists worked on their pieces, lost in their own worlds. "This is where I spend most of my time," Lena said. "It's a community space for local artists. We work here, display our art, help each other grow." David looked around, genuinely impressed. "This is incredible." Lena gave a small smile. "I've been coming here since I was 16. It's the only place I've ever felt like I belonged." David turned to her. "Are you an artist?" She shrugged. "I don't know if I'd call myself that, I just create." She led him to the back where a canvas sat on an easel. David's breath caught when he saw it. It was a painting of Sarah. The details were hauntingly accurate, from the way her hair curled around her face to the warmth in her eyes. It was as if Lena had captured a piece of her mother's soul on the canvas. "I painted this after she died," Lena said quietly. "It was my way of holding on to her." David swallowed the lump in his throat. "It's beautiful." Lena hesitated before speaking again. "I don't know why I brought you here," she admitted. "Maybe I just wanted you to see a part of me that isn't just anger." David turned to her, his expression soft. "I'm grateful you did." For the first time since they met, Lena didn't look at him like a stranger. There was still hesitation in her eyes, but there was also something else, something fragile but real. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted. "Neither do I," David said. "But I'd like to find out together." Lena nodded slowly, as if considering it for the first time. The gap between them didn't feel so impossible to bridge. David had spent his entire life controlling every aspect of his world, his business, his finances, even the people around him. But sitting in that small Brooklyn art studio, watching his daughter paint, he realized that this was something he couldn't dictate, something he couldn't rush. Lena moved with ease, her brush gliding across the canvas, lost in a world he wasn't a part of. The silence between them was different now. Not awkward, not strained, but almost comfortable. A week ago, he had been a stranger to her. Now, at least, he was a presence in her life. A fragile presence, perhaps, but one that wasn't being pushed away. As he sat there, watching her mix colors on her palette, he wondered what Sarah would say if she could see them now. Would she be happy that he had finally found their daughter, or would she be furious that he had been absent for so long? He wanted to believe she would forgive him, that she would understand that he hadn't known. But deep down, he wasn't sure. Lena finally broke the silence, setting down her brush and stretching her arms. "So what exactly do you do anyway?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "I mean, I know you're rich, but what does that actually mean?" David chuckled at her bluntness. "I run a real estate investment firm. We buy properties, develop them, sell them for a profit." Lena nodded slowly. "So you're the kind of guy who turns old neighborhoods into overpriced condos." David sighed. "Not always. Sometimes yes, but it's more than that. We also invest in restoring historic buildings, bringing new business into struggling areas. It's not just about money." Lena studied him, as if trying to determine whether she believed him or not. "So you buy things, flip them, and make them better?" "In a way, yes," David said. She smirked. "Well, good luck trying to flip me." David laughed, shaking his head. "That's not what I'm trying to do, Lena." Her expression softened slightly, and she leaned back against the table. "I guess I just don't know what this is supposed to be. Are you trying to make up for lost time, or do you just feel guilty?" David exhaled. "Both." He met her gaze. "But mostly, I just want a chance to know you." Lena nodded but didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, almost reluctantly, she said, "I have a show next month. Some of my work is going to be displayed. It's kind of a big deal." David straightened slightly. "That's amazing. Where is it?" "Lower East Side, a small gallery, nothing fancy." She hesitated. "You can come if you want." David felt something shift in his chest. A small invitation, but an invitation nonetheless. "I'd love to." The next few weeks passed in a blur. David kept himself busy with work, but his thoughts often drifted to Lena. He found himself researching art, trying to understand the world she was a part of. He even visited a few galleries, something he had never done before, trying to see things the way she saw them. He wanted to support her but didn't want to overstep. She had made it clear she needed time, and he was determined to respect that. The night of the show arrived, and David found himself more nervous than he had been for any business deal. He wasn't sure what to expect, whether Lena would acknowledge him or if she would regret inviting him at all. When he arrived at the small gallery, the place was already crowded. The walls were lined with paintings, each one carrying a unique story, a different perspective. And then, in the center of the room, he saw her work. The first painting was abstract, chaotic, yet strangely beautiful. The second was more structured, a portrait of a woman, her face partially obscured as if caught between two identities. And then there was it, the painting of Sarah. This one was different from the version Lena had shown him before. It was raw, more vulnerable. Sarah's expression in the painting was softer, almost as if she was looking at something, or someone, with quiet understanding. David felt his throat tighten. He had spent years trying to bury the pain of losing Sarah, convincing himself that grief was something he could outwork, something he could push aside. But standing there looking at that painting, he realized how much of her was still alive in Lena. He turned to find Lena standing nearby, watching him carefully. "You painted this recently?" he said, his voice quieter than he intended. She nodded. "Yeah." David swallowed. "It's incredible." Lena shifted on her feet, looking almost uncomfortable. "I wasn't sure if I wanted to put it in the show," she admitted. "But then I thought maybe she'd want to be here." David nodded, his chest heavy, with emotion. "She would." They stood there in silence for a moment before Lena spoke again. "I was afraid you wouldn't come." David looked at her, surprised. "Why?" She shrugged. "I don't know. People say things all the time. Doesn't mean they follow through." David met her gaze. "I will always." Lena didn't respond right away, but something in her expression softened. "Well, thanks for coming," she finally said. David smiled. Wouldn't have missed it for the world. As the night continued, David watched Lena interact with the other artists, saw the way she came alive in this space. She belonged here, in this world of color and expression, and for the first time, he felt like he was starting to belong in hers. David hadn't realized how much he had been holding his breath until the night of Lena's art show ended. As he sat in his car parked outside the gallery on the Lower East Side, he replayed the moments of the evening in his mind. The way she hesitated before introducing him to her friends. The nervous energy in her posture when he first arrived. And finally, the almost imperceptible warmth in her voice when she thanked him for coming. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time since discovering he had a daughter, he felt like he had taken a real step toward being part of her life. He wasn't sure what came next. Was there a next step? Or was this the best he could hope for? A few shared moments? An occasional conversation? He wanted more, but he knew better than to push. He had already missed too much. The following morning, he found himself scrolling through his phone, searching for anything about the art world. He read about contemporary artists, gallery exhibits, and art movements, trying to understand the space Lena inhabited. He had spent his entire life making decisions based on logic, calculations, and risks. But this was different. This wasn't a business deal where he could predict the outcome. He was navigating uncharted territory, and for the first time in years, he was okay with that. A few days later, Lena called. Lena. It was the first time she had reached out to him instead of the other way around. "Hey," she said, her voice casual but carrying a hint of something he couldn't quite place. "Do you have time for lunch?" David sat up straighter at his desk, momentarily, stunned. "Of course," he said, perhaps too quickly. "Where?" "There's a little diner in Queens. It's nothing fancy. I'll be there." When he arrived at the diner, Lena was already there, sitting in a booth by the window. She looked different, more relaxed but still guarded. David slid into the seat across from her, studying her face. He realized that for all the conversations they had shared in the past few weeks, he still didn't really know her. Lena took a sip of her iced coffee before speaking. So, here's the deal. I don't know what this is supposed to look like. You and me. David nodded slowly, giving her space to continue. I spent my whole life without you, she said, and now, suddenly, you're here. And I don't know if that's good or bad. David swallowed hard, choosing his words carefully. I can't change the past, Lena. If I could, I would. But I can't. All I can do is be here now, if you'll let me. She tapped her fingers against her glass, thinking, I don't want to rush anything. I don't want forced family dinners or weird emotional moments. She paused. I don't know. I want to take it one step at a time. David nodded. That sounds fair. Lena exhaled, as if relieved that he wasn't pushing her for more. And I don't want money. Just putting that out there. David smiled slightly. Noted. She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if trying to figure out if she could trust him. I have a lot of questions, she admitted. Ask me anything. Lena hesitated before speaking. Did you love my mom? David felt the weight of the question settle over him. He hadn't allowed himself to think about Sarah in that way for a long time. Yes, he said, his voice quieter now. I did. Lena nodded as if she had expected that answer but still needed to hear it. Then why weren't you there? David took a deep breath. He owed her the truth. Your mother and I, we had a complicated relationship. When we were together, we were young. I thought I had my whole life planned out, and she didn't fit into that plan, not in the way she deserved to. When she left, I didn't know she was pregnant. If I had, things would have been different. Lena didn't respond right away, and David wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Finally, she said, She never talked about you much. Just bits and pieces. I always figured you were some guy who didn't care. I cared, David said firmly. I just didn't know. Lena played with the straw in her drink. I think I want to know more about you. About her. About everything. David felt something in his chest ease. Then I'll tell you everything you want to know. The rest of the lunch was filled with questions, some light, some heavy. She asked about his work, his childhood, his life before he knew about her. In return, he asked about her art, her childhood, her favorite memories of Sarah. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. A start. As they left the diner, Lena hesitated before speaking again. Look, I don't know where this is going, but I guess I don't mind having you around. David smiled. It was the closest thing to acceptance she had given him yet. I'm glad to hear that. As she walked away, he realized something. This wasn't just about him trying to be a father. It was about understanding the life that had existed without him and finding a way to fit into it. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And for the first time, he had hope that maybe, just maybe, Lena wanted that too. David had never been the kind of man who doubted himself. Every decision he had made in his career had been deliberate, calculated, and precise. But as he drove home from the diner that evening, his mind was filled with uncertainty. Lena had given him a chance, a small one, but a chance nonetheless. He replayed the conversation in his mind, holding on to the way she had finally looked at him, not with resentment but with curiosity. It was a shift, subtle but important. He knew now that she wanted to know more, even if she wouldn't admit it outright. And that meant there was hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur of cautious interactions. Lena wasn't the type to call or text just for the sake of conversation. But every so often she would send him a message, sometimes a question about her mother, sometimes just a passing comment about something she had read or seen. David responded to every message, careful never to push too hard. He had learned, early on, that patience was key with her. One evening, as he sat in his study with his laptop open, an email arrived from Lena. It was unexpected considering they had just spoken the day before. The subject line was simple, an invitation. His heart pounded as he clicked it open. My friend is having a small gathering at her studio in Brooklyn this weekend. It's nothing formal, just a few artists and some people from the community. If you want to come, you can. No pressure. Lena. David stared at the screen, rereading the words. It wasn't an emotional message. It wasn't even particularly warm. But the fact that she had invited him on her own, without prompting, felt like a breakthrough. He quickly typed out a response, keeping his tone just as casual. I'd love to. Let me know the time and address. See you there. The night of the gathering, David arrived at the studio, a renovated warehouse in Williamsburg. The space was dimly lit, with paintings and sculptures scattered throughout. It wasn't the kind of event he was used to attending. No formal attire, no networking opportunities, just people talking, laughing, and sharing their art. He felt out of place, but he was determined to push through it. He spotted Lena across the room talking to a young woman with bright pink hair. She hadn't seen him yet, and for a moment he hesitated, wondering if he was intruding on something. But then, as if sensing his presence, Lena turned. Their eyes met, and she gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, not necessarily warmth, but something close to it. He made his way over, hands in his pockets to keep from fidgeting. Hey, he said, keeping his voice light. Lena gestured toward the woman beside her. David, this is Olivia. She runs this space. Olivia extended a hand, her grip firm. So you're the dad. David raised an eyebrow, glancing at Lena, who rolled her eyes. She has no filter, Lena muttered. Olivia grinned. It's a good thing, no? David chuckled. I guess I should be prepared then. The night went on with easy conversation, though David noticed Lena keeping her distance. She introduced him to a few people, but she didn't hover, nor did she seem particularly eager to stick by his side. He understood. This was her world, and he was merely a guest. Still, the fact that she had invited him meant something. At one point, he found himself in a quiet corner of the studio looking at one of Lena's paintings. It was abstract, full of deep reds and blues that bled into one another, chaotic yet intentional. He could feel something in the piece, something unspoken but powerful. It's about my mom. Lena's voice came from behind him. David turned to see her standing there, arms crossed. It's beautiful, he said honestly. It feels raw. Lena nodded. I painted it a few years ago, when I was still trying to figure out what grief was supposed to feel like. David swallowed the lump in his throat. Did it help? She shrugged. Some days not. There was a pause before she spoke again. She never really got to be an artist the way she wanted to. She was always working, always trying to make ends meet. I think about that a lot. David felt the weight of her words. He had spent so much time thinking about what he had lost, years of not knowing Lena existed. But he hadn't given enough thought to what Sarah had lost, the struggles she must have faced, the sacrifices she had made. She would be proud of you, he said softly. Lena's expression shifted, something vulnerable flashing in her eyes before she looked away. Maybe. David wanted to say more, but he knew better than to push. Instead, he just stood there, looking at the painting with her. For a moment, it felt like an understanding was forming between them. Not forced, not rushed, just real. As the night wound down, Lena walked him to the door. You didn't embarrass me, she said, smirking slightly. I'll take that as a win, David replied. She hesitated before speaking again. Thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me. Lena nodded, then turned back toward the studio without another word. David watched her go, a quiet sense of relief settling over him. They still had a long way to go, but tonight had been another step, and for now that was enough. David stood outside Lena's apartment in Brooklyn, holding a small, neatly wrapped box in his hands. He had spent the last few weeks carefully building their relationship, knowing it was a fragile bridge that could easily collapse if he moved too fast or said the wrong thing. But after the night at the art studio, something had changed. Lena had started to let him in. Not completely, but enough for him to see glimpses of the daughter he never knew he had. Tonight, he was here because he wanted to take the next step, one that had been on his mind for a long time. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. The door swung open and Lena stood there, her expression unreadable. "You didn't tell me you were coming," she said, leaning against the doorframe. David smiled. "I wanted it to be a surprise." He hesitated before handing her the small box. "I brought you something." Lena eyed the box suspiciously before taking it and stepping aside to let him in. "You didn't have to get me anything." "I know," David said, watching as she sat down on the couch and carefully unwrapped the box. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, simple but elegant. There was a small engraving on the inside. "For the daughter I never knew but will always love." Lena stared at it for a long moment, her fingers lightly tracing the words. David held his breath, unsure of what her reaction would be. Then, without looking at him, she whispered, "It's beautiful." David exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lift off his chest. "I wanted you to have something from me, something real." Lena nodded, still staring at the bracelet. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to be someone's daughter." David sat down across from her, keeping his voice gentle. "I don't know how to be your father either. But we can figure it out together." Lena finally looked up at him, and for the first time there was no anger, no resentment, just honesty. "Okay." It was a simple word, but it carried so much weight. David felt his throat tighten, but he just nodded. "Okay." Over the next few months, their relationship continued to grow. They started meeting regularly, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just for a walk through Central Park. Lena had walls, and David respected them, never pushing too hard. But little by little, those walls started to come down. One evening, they were walking through Times Square, the bright lights reflecting in the windows around them. Lena stuffed her hands into her pockets and glanced at him. "I looked you up, before I met you." David chuckled. "And what did you find?" "That you're rich," she said with a smirk. "Like, stupid rich." David laughed. "Guilty." Lena sighed. "It's weird. My mom never wanted anything from you. She never even told you about me, and we struggled so much. There were nights she skipped meals just to make sure I had enough to eat. And you?" She stopped walking and turned to face him. "You had everything." David felt a deep ache in his chest. "I know, and I hate that I wasn't there. If I had known—" "I know," Lena interrupted. I wish she would have told you. Maybe things would have been different." David nodded, swallowing the guilt that threatened to choke him. "Maybe, but all we have now is the future." Lena looked down at the bracelet on her wrist, the one she had been wearing every day since he gave it to her. "Yeah, the future." As the months turned into a year, their bond grew stronger. David started introducing Lena to parts of his life, his work, his colleagues, the things that had once mattered to him so much but now seemed insignificant compared to the relationship he was building with his daughter. And Lena, in turn, led him into her world. She showed him her art, told him stories about her childhood, and slowly she started calling him Dad. The first time she said it, David had to excuse himself to the bathroom just to pull himself together. Then one day, Lena called him with unexpected news. "I want you to come with me somewhere," she said over the phone. "Of course." "Where to?" "My mom's grave." David's heart clenched. He had been meaning to visit but had never wanted to do it alone. Now Lena was asking him to go with her. "I'd be honored," he said softly. A few days later, they stood in front of Sarah's grave in Greenwood Cemetery. The air was crisp, and the leaves had begun to change color. Lena knelt down and placed fresh flowers on the grave before speaking. "Mom, this is David," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know you never told him about me, and I don't know why, but he's here now." She took a deep breath and glanced at him. "And I think you'd like him." David felt his eyes burn as he placed his hand on the headstone. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," he whispered, "for not being there, for not knowing. But I promise you, I will be the father our daughter deserves." Lena reached out and took his hand, surprising him. "I think she'd be okay with that." David squeezed her hand, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Life had taken away so many years from them, but now they had a second chance. And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed that they were going to be okay. 2 years had passed since David first met Lena at Evelyn's funeral. What had begun as a shock and uncertainty had gradually transformed into one of the most meaningful relationships in both their lives. They had settled into a comfortable rhythm, meeting regularly for dinners, gallery exhibitions, and occasional weekends exploring New York's hidden gems. Today was Lena's birthday, her first birthday since they had truly become father and daughter. David had spent weeks planning, wanting to make it special without overwhelming her. He knew her boundaries had softened, but he still respected her need for space and independence. He arrived at her apartment building early, carrying a small gift bag and a bouquet of wildflowers. Not roses or lilies, but the kind of untamed blooms that reminded him of Sarah's free spirit. Lena had mentioned once that her mother loved wildflowers, saying they couldn't be contained or controlled just like her. When Lena opened the door, her smile was genuine. She was wearing the silver bracelet he had given her, which now rarely left her wrist. "Happy birthday," David said, handing her the flowers. "They're beautiful," she replied, bringing them to her nose. "Just like Mom's favorites." "I remember you mentioning it," he said, following her inside. Her apartment had changed over the past year. More organized, more artwork on the walls, including a new painting of the Manhattan skyline that David recognized as her work. "I have something for you," he said, handing her the gift bag. Lena raised an eyebrow. "I thought our dinner tonight was my gift." "That too," David smiled. "But this is something else." She sat down on her couch, carefully opening the bag. Inside was a leather-bound sketchbook with her initials embossed on the cover, and beneath it a small velvet box. She opened the box first, revealing a vintage gold locket. "Open it," David encouraged gently. Lena clicked open the locket, and her breath caught. Inside was a tiny photograph of Sarah on one side, and on the other, a picture of Lena as a baby that David had found among Sarah's things, which Lena had shared with him months ago. "David," she whispered, her fingers tracing the delicate edge of the locket. "I wanted you to have something that connected all of us," he explained. "Something that acknowledged where you came from and who you are." Tears welled in Lena's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. She had grown more comfortable showing emotion around him, but old habits died hard. "It's perfect," she said, immediately putting it on. "Thank you." She then turned to the sketchbook, flipping through its blank pages before noticing something tucked in the back, an envelope. She looked at David questioningly. "Go ahead," he nodded. Inside the envelope was a deed for a small storefront property in Bushwick, not far from the community art space she frequented. "What is this?" she asked, confusion written across her face. "It's yours," David explained. "If you want it. A space for your own gallery or studio. Whatever you want it to be." Lena stared at the paper, then back at him. "I told you I didn't want your money." "This isn't about money," David said carefully. "This is about your talent, about believing in you. You've shown me your world, Lena. I've seen what art means to you and how talented you are. This isn't charity. It's investment in your future." Lena fell silent, looking down at the deed. For a moment, David worried he had overstepped, pushed too far. But then she looked up, her eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions. "No one's ever believed in me like this before," she said quietly. Your mother did, David replied. And I do too. Lena set the papers down carefully and stood up, pacing around the small living room. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything now, David assured her. Think about it. If you decide it's not what you want, we'll figure something else out. There are no strings attached. She stopped pacing and turned to face him. Why are you doing all this? You didn't even know I existed 2 years ago. David considered his words carefully. Because, from the moment I learned about you, nothing has been more important than making up for the time we lost. I can't give you back your childhood, but I can be here for your future. Lena nodded slowly, processing his words. Then, surprising him completely, she stepped forward and hugged him, something she rarely initiated. Thank you, Dad, she whispered, against his shoulder. The word still made his heart swell every time she said it. Later that evening, as they sat at a quiet restaurant in the West Village, David watched as Lena animatedly described her vision for the space. Her initial hesitation had given way to excitement as ideas flowed. A gallery featuring emerging artists, workshops for underprivileged kids, a space where creativity could flourish without the pressure of commercial success. You know, she said, pausing briefly. Mom always talked about having her own studio someday. She never got the chance. Tell me more about her dreams, David encouraged. Lena smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. She wanted to teach art to kids. She believed everyone had creativity inside them that just needed nurturing. On my 10th birthday, she took me to this fancy art supply store and let me pick out whatever I wanted. We couldn't afford it, not really, but she said some things were worth the sacrifice. David listened, cherishing these glimpses into Sarah's life after him, the woman who had raised such a remarkable daughter despite all the challenges. I think your gallery should have a teaching space, he suggested, something dedicated to her vision. Lena's eyes lit up. The Sarah Brooks Workshop, she said, testing the name. I like that. As they finished their meal, Lena reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly. I spent so many birthdays wishing I had a father, she admitted, and now that I have one, it's nothing like I imagined. David tensed slightly. Is that good or bad? It's better, she said simply. Because you're real, not some perfect father figure I made up in my head. You're just you. And somehow that's enough. David felt his throat tighten with emotion. After a lifetime of achieving success through wealth and power, the simple acceptance from his daughter meant more than any business deal ever had. I'm still learning, he admitted. I'll probably make mistakes. We both will, Lena replied, but we have time to figure it out. Time. One thing he had thought was lost to them forever, now stretched before them with possibility. As they walked out of the restaurant into the cool evening air, David couldn't help but think of how differently his life had turned out from what he had planned. He had spent decades building an empire, yet his most valuable legacy was walking, beside him, a daughter who was teaching him what truly mattered. 3 months after Lena's birthday, her gallery was beginning to take shape. Bridges, the name she had chosen, was more than just a space for art. It was becoming a community hub. David had stepped back, allowing her to make all the decisions while providing support only when asked. Today, he had been invited to see the nearly completed renovation before the grand opening next month. When he arrived, Lena was directing workers hanging track lighting, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, paint splatters decorating her overalls. What do you think? She asked, gesturing around the transformed space. It's incredible, David replied, honestly. The industrial brick walls contrasted beautifully with the polished concrete floors. Large windows flooded the space with natural light, and at the back a separate area was furnished with tables and art supplies, the Sarah Brooks Workshop. It feels right, Lena said, a quiet pride in her voice. Like something Mom would have loved. She handed him a framed photograph. Sarah at an easel, mid-20s, laughing at the camera. I thought this should hang by the workshop entrance. David nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. In that moment, standing in the physical manifestation of their shared hope, the bridge between their separate lives felt complete. The grand opening of Bridges had been a spectacular success. Art, critics, local artists, and even a few celebrities had attended, drawn by the gallery's unique mission of promoting emerging artists from disadvantaged backgrounds. Lena's vision had resonated with people, and the press coverage had been overwhelmingly positive. David had attended, of course, but had deliberately kept a low profile. This was Lena's achievement, and he wanted her to have the spotlight. A week after the opening, they met for coffee at a small cafe near the gallery. Lena looked tired but happy, still riding the high of her success. "I have something to ask you," she said, setting down her cup. "Anything," David replied. "Why didn't you look for my mom after you left Chicago?" The question caught him off guard. They had discussed Sarah many times, but never this directly. "I thought she wouldn't want to hear from me," he admitted. "I chose my career over her. I thought reaching out would just cause more pain." Lena nodded slowly. "She waited for you to call. She told me once." The simple statement hit David like a physical blow. All those years, all those missed opportunities. "I was a coward," he said finally, "and that's a truth I have to live with." Lena reached across the table and took his hand. "We can't change the past, Dad, but thank you for being honest about it." Spring arrived in New York, bringing with it a sense of renewal. Bridges had been open for 6 months, establishing itself as a respected gallery in the art community. Lena had curated 3 successful exhibitions, and the Sarah Brooks workshop was always full of eager students. David had been approached by several reporters wanting to do stories about the billionaire real estate mogul's daughter and her gallery, but he had declined all interviews. This success was Lena's alone, earned through her talent and vision, not his name or money. One afternoon, David received a call from his assistant. A representative from the Museum of Modern Art wanted to meet with him about a potential donation. Normally, he would have handled such requests himself, but today he had a different idea. "Forward the details to Lena Brooks," he instructed. "She handles all my arts philanthropy now." That evening, Lena called him, excitement bubbling in her voice. "Did you really put me in charge of your arts foundation?" she asked. "Who better?" David replied. "You understand art in a way I never will. But that's millions of dollars in grants every year. So make them count," he said simply. There was a pause before Lena spoke again. "I'm proud to be a Reynolds," she said softly. "Even if I keep my mom's name professionally." David felt his heart swell at her words. "I'm the proud one," he answered, "more than you'll ever know." Fall had returned to New York, marking 3 years since Evelyn's funeral, the day that had changed everything. David found himself thinking about how different his life had become. The empire he had built still thrived, but his priorities had shifted entirely. Today, he and Lena were returning to Greenwood Cemetery, not just to visit Sarah's grave, but to unveil something special. As they walked along the quiet paths, colored, leaves crunching beneath their feet, Lena slipped her hand into his, a gesture that had become natural between them. "Are you nervous?" David asked. "A little," Lena admitted. "I hope she would approve." They reached Sarah's plot, where a new headstone now stood. The simple marble was engraved with Sarah's name, dates, and beneath that, "Beloved mother, artist, and teacher," followed by "Her legacy continues." Lena knelt and placed a small framed photograph against the stone, a picture of children painting in the Sarah Brooks workshop. "The first scholarship recipient got accepted to art school yesterday," Lena said quietly. "A 17-year-old girl from Queens reminds me of Mom." David placed his hand on her shoulder. "This is how we honor her, not just with memories, but by continuing what she started." Lena stood, wiping away a tear. "I think this is exactly what she would have wanted." 5 years had passed since that fateful day at Evelyn's funeral. David sat on the rooftop terrace of Lena's loft, watching as she put the finishing touches on a painting, a landscape of Chicago's lakefront where her parents had first met. "You know," David said, sipping his coffee. I never imagined my life would turn out this way. Lena glanced up from her canvas. Having second thoughts about retiring? David chuckled. Not at all. Giving you the reins to Reynolds Foundation was the best decision I've made. The foundation had expanded under Lena's direction, funding arts education in underserved communities nationwide. Meanwhile, Bridges had become a cultural landmark, launching dozens of artists' careers. I got another offer for my memoir, David mentioned casually. Are you going to take it this time? Lena asked. I might, he replied. There's a story worth telling now. Lena set down her brush and joined him, looking out over the city they both loved. Mom's birthday is next week, she said. I'm thinking of expanding the workshop program to Chicago, back to where it all began. David smiled, wrapping an arm around his daughter's shoulders. Sarah would love that. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, David felt a profound sense of peace. The path to this moment had been unexpected and often painful, but standing beside his daughter, he knew with absolute certainty this was always where he was meant to be.